Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of the Odyssey to book 17, Stranger at the Gates. I mean, consider this for a moment. We've been in many ways building towards this moment, and I mean, this reminds us of any movie where you have a homecoming. The physical, geographic structure of the house, the home, and what it's like to finally arrive here after 20 years. Back in his palace, Odysseus will finally arrive. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, I certainly recommend you hit that, go to that AP folder and see the prior lectures we've already given. We've given full lectures on every book of the Iliad and now the Odyssey up through books 16. Let's just summarize really quickly where we've been, just to remind ourselves and place ourselves. We actually will start in book 1, after the invocation of the Muse, in the very palace where we finally will return now in book 17. It will be there that we will see Telemachus in the first 4 books of the Odyssey in that Telemachus, where Athena will come to him, and then again at line 340, 341, she will tell him it's time to grow up. Telemachus is going to have to witness something in book 17 that happens to his father. He will know, of course, the old beggar is his father, and he's going to have to put up with that. And this will be a sign of his own coming-of-age story, that Bildungsroman, as sometimes we refer to it. In book 2, Telemachus tries to call the assembly. We find out just how wretched bad these suitors are, especially Antinous, and we're going to see Antinous again in book 17. We're going to have a sign of an eagle. This will come back again and again in book 2. We'll see that. And then we'll see Telemachus leaving with Athena by his side in the form of mentor. Then in book 3, we have Telemachus at Pylos with Nestor. We're going to get another sign. Athena's going to fly away as an eagle. Pisistratus, Nestor's boy, will take off with Telemachus. And in book 4, they'll spend their time with Menelaus and with Helen. Of course, we've got that amazing scene where she will dope them, and then we have famous stories about Odysseus told. Finally, at the end of book 4, we're back to the suitors who are going to try to assault, kill Telemachus on his way back from Menelaus. And Penelope, of course, beside herself with grief. So many of these first 4 books will be subsumed in book 17. So this is why it's kind of important for us to review closely. Books 5, 6, 7, and 8, Odysseus arriving with the Phaeacians on the island of the Phaeacians. First, he has to get off Calypso's island. Book 5, of course, Poseidon is mad at him because Odysseus has wounded, blinded Polyphemus, Poseidon's son. Almost drowns him, almost kills him. He washes up on a beach. Book 6, Odysseus with Nausicaa, and we get that first of many kinds of ideas that Odysseus is this great weaver of tales, this great poet, this great singer of songs, of poems. Of course, book 7, in the court of the Phaeacians, we're already being set up for what it looks like to practice Xenia, that guest-host relationship, in the best of ways. Obviously, book 17, we're going to see it's complete and total opposite. Odysseus as supplicant. In book 8, we have the Phaeacian Games. We're going to come back to this book. It's almost as if book 17 subsumes almost every book that I've mentioned so far. There is some almost direct reference, and we're actually going to get some lines quoted right out of book 8, because halfway through that book, the Phaeacians are playing their games, they're doing their games, they're throwing discs, this kind of thing. And Brodsea, one of the young men, will taunt Odysseus by suggesting Odysseus is kind of lazy, he doesn't want to get involved, he's not very strong. And Odysseus will say a couple of things to him, not least of which, it's a funny thing how the gods will give a young man beauty, handsomeness, but not give him much intelligence or wit. And then he picks up the largest disc, throws it farther than everyone, and everybody's like, whoa, 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 who are you? And of course, it will be at this point that in book 9, we will begin with the real story of who Odysseus actually is. We've said this already. Everything in the Odyssey is about stories. In many ways, our AP curriculum is all kind of structured around this idea of we are the stories we tell, with the stories we accept and the stories we reject. So much of the Odyssey is about this idea. Why? Because stories tell patterns, and we pick up a lot of them, starting in book 9. The sack of the Sicony city, the land of the lotus eaters, that temptation to forget. Polyphemus' blinding, we already mentioned, will all happen in book 9. And the curse that will be called down. We're going to see a similar kind of curse that's called down by Odysseus and by Eumaeus, more Eumaeus than anyone, in this book 17. Book 10, Aeolus, the wind god. They go away, then they're blown back. Then we'll have the Lystragonians who will attack them and destroy all of Odysseus' ships. Then for a year he is stuck with Circe. In book 11 he journeys down into the underworld, into the house of the dead, where he meets Tiresias and of course his mother. But importantly for our book here, he meets Agamemnon, and Agamemnon will tell him, when you go back to your house, don't do what I did and show up with all the pomp and glory, but rather go back secret and pay particular attention to people who could hurt you. Be skeptical, test them to find out if they're legitimate or not. Odysseus obviously going to take all of that to heart. Of course, book 12 will finish this flashback series of stories back to the island of Circe. There they will bury Elpenor, their pal, who died unexpectedly, and they didn't even know until Odysseus met him down in the house of the dead. Then the instructions from Circe: put wax in the ears of your sailors, sail past the island of the Sirens so you can hear the song of the Sirens. That temptation to hear the song and stay forever on the island and never actually get home. That idea of the song and the haunting song, the song that captures us. Demodocus will have played the game when we were with Odysseus on the island of the Phaeacians, just in the last few books in book 8. Here we're going to hear about a song of a bard as Odysseus arrives at his palace. I mean, the touches of Homer in this book are brilliant. As Odysseus arrives at his palace, you will have, in fact, the song of a poet. That famous bard Phemicus, and we'll have something to say obviously about him. In book 13, the Phaeacians are blown away by the fact that Odysseus's men ate the cattle of the sun god. Zeus jacked the ship. All of the sailors were dead, killed in the water. Odysseus finds his way to the island of Calypso, and it is at that point that the Phaeacians say, you know what, let's return Odysseus back home. And for that, they themselves are jacked. This is, of course, a difficult theodictic question, as we raised it in the lecture. Why Zeus would allow Poseidon to jack the Phaeacians for showing Xenia, right? But that's exactly what happens. Odysseus then will meet Athena in book 13, and we'll begin this next phase where he is now on Ithaca, but he doesn't know it, and he spins stories. Amazing storyteller. Book 14, Odysseus then will end up with Eumaeus, who is going to play a pivotal role for us as well in book 17. The swineherd. We get a long story that Eumaeus is going to reference with Penelope in book 17. And then in book 15, finally, we have Telemachus, who is ready to come home. He tells Menelaus and Helen, I've got to come home. He does come back to Eumaeus, and Odysseus and Eumaeus will exchange stories as well. Finally, in book 16, we just finished it, Odysseus finally is going to meet his boy. These are these recognition scenes, as we've talked about them already, where Odysseus and Athena will have a conversation. Athena will change him and say, it's time. And sure enough, he tells Telemachus who he is and what they will do. They make their plans, right? Finally, Penelope will tell Antinous, who is going to turn out to be the arch villain of this poem, knock it off with my boy. Please leave him alone. Don't mess with him anymore. Now, the idea here, again, as I've said in all of our lectures, is that you are doing this reading on your own because of the tension that Homer can brilliantly create in this text. I've had students that in one part of this story actually weep. I will explain maybe why when we get there. The story of the death of Argos is one of the most famous stories in all of mythology, and I hope we can enjoy it together here in a moment. But it does, I mean, if you haven't been reading this up to this point, I'll say about the same moment in our Iliad lecture, 16, 17, I said, just don't listen to me before you've read your own reading of this, and then pick up what I'm doing and help you. Our learning theory, I want to reiterate, I always do because it's our key objective, to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Notice the game I'm already playing when I was doing a summary of all of our previous books where we've been. In other words, reading the Odyssey and studying the Odyssey is a journey of its own. It is an Odyssey of its own. But I constantly want to remind you, Tennyson says it in his great poem Ulysses about, of course, the aged Odysseus, right? I am a part of all that I have met. Yet all experience is an arch where through gleam that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. In other words, The idea is that we're always trying to connect new information, old information. Notice in my review, I said that Book 17 assumes so many parts of the previous Odyssey, and we're going to see this again and again, all right? We will, of course, do this in our annotative process by answering our 3 guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? Right, summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, our rhetorical study for this, along with our study of the Iliad, has continued to be symbolism and irony. We will see one of the most profound symbols in all of classic literature in Book 17 of Odyssey. I hope I can help you to see them. And of course, the irony will be ubiquitous throughout the entire thing. Why? Well, people like Alcinous will have, Antinous will have no idea at all that when he's throwing a footstool at Odysseus, that he is throwing a footstool at Odysseus. He thinks he's just jacking on an old blind, or on an old beggar guy. Finally, at 3A, we ask, how can we relate this information to ourselves? First, at 3A, relating to other texts, beginning with the Iliad. I mean, that makes sense. When we pick up the Aeneid, we'll play the same game only with the Iliad and the Odyssey, okay? We'll also ask about other texts that we know, that we're familiar with. Homecoming texts. Oh man, after the Odyssey, homecoming texts, you could argue like half the major texts that are constructed in our pantheon of world literature, and we'll have to talk about those. Finally, at 3B, and most importantly in our learning theory, how can you own this text? How can you relate to this information? If I'm doing anything at all with you, and I hope that I'm doing something with you, it is that I can help you to at least try to connect this information in your own life in some way. Okay. Book 17, I like to call it From Dogs to Dancing. You'll understand why at the end of this one, okay? And this is, of course, the great Argos book anyway. So, and if you're a dog lover, I am. So if you're a dog lover, you have to love this. And it's funny the number of people who don't know much about the Odyssey, but they know the story of Argos, so we'll get to it here in a moment, right? Just to begin, though, I'd like to point out, if I could, for just a second, think about this for just a moment. Note that during his Odyssey, Odysseus has learned, right, the dangers of self-disclosure, right? And the value of maybe not always showing himself and who he is. Think about this. When he was in the cave with Polyphemus, first he called himself nobody. That will be referenced in this book as well. But he calls himself nobody to Polyphemus. But after he gets out, he has to be the one that makes his disclosure of who he is. Hey, Polyphemus, I'm Odysseus, son of Laertes. I'm the one that blinded you. Which is, of course, a really stupid thing to do, because it landed him all his men dead in the end because of the curse, right? And it landed him for another 10 years. He never got home. So it's interesting that when then Odysseus ends up with the Phaeacians, he very slowly wants to reveal who he is. Notice with Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, he finally will, only because he's seen crying, right, by Alcinous. And he's kind of goaded, right, by Broadsia into throwing that disc. And then people are like, whoa, 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 who are you? So he's kind of, disclosing himself. But notice with Eumaeus, and notice with the suitors, no disclosure. Notice with Telemachus, it will be only because Athena tells him to. And then with Penelope, and then later with Laertes, his father, it's only going to be later after he does it, right? In other words, Odysseus is getting wiser, but he's also getting more treacherous. Note line 213 of this book. That word treacherous will come back, okay? All right, let's do a real quick plot summary and of Book 17, and then we'll get to the lines of the book, right? The very beginning of the book, Telemachus will decide to leave, to go back. He's got to present himself and his court to his mom. Think about that. He hasn't actually been home to his palace yet, and he hasn't seen his mother yet. He gives instructions to Eumaeus. Send Odysseus, the old blind beggar, the old beggar, he's not blind, the old beggar, to the palace and let him beg. And then we have this really interesting sarcastic line about, I can't be expected to take care of every beggar who shows up at my palace. And then Telemachus is at the palace. There he will see Eurycla, the old nurse. In many ways, there's two people in his life, Eumaeus and then Eurycla, who are both kind of the ones that helped to raise Odysseus, or Telemachus, because Odysseus wasn't there. Then, of course, with his mom Penelope, she asks about Odysseus. He says, I don't want to talk about it, and he gives her orders. I need you to go get a bath, get dressed, etc., etc. Some people have faulted Telemachus for treating his mother this way, but within the culture of its day, this is expected that a young man, a boy, would begin to grow into maturity and begin to treat his mother with more command, more, instructions or whatever. And certainly in the poem, Penelope's not offended by this, but rather heartened by the fact that her son is growing up. Finally, Theoclymenus comes back into the poem, and Telemachus will show him favor. Telemachus has no interest in talking to these suitors at all, and they're kind of stunned by this, right? Penelope then will have a conversation with Telemachus after he and Theoclymenus get their bath. Any news of Odysseus? He says yes. He gives a review of his travels, leaving some things out. We'll see about that one. Theoclymenus, however, will say it. I saw the sign. Odysseus is here, which will, of course, hearten Penelope, but at the same time lead her to think that probably it isn't going to happen. We then see the suitors throwing their discs and spears. They're out there practicing to be warriors. Get the irony of that, right? They never actually have been warriors, but they practice at being warriors, and then they're called in for their meal. Meanwhile, Odysseus with Eumaeus are going to be walking this somewhat torturous path, as it said, and they run into Melanthius, who is this disgusting goat herd, who's going to be really nasty to Odysseus, say all kinds of mean things, kick him in the hip, try and kick him down, but Odysseus is too strong for him to be hit to the floor. And then a curse by Eumaeus will be called down on Melanthius that we'll get to. Finally, Odysseus, Eumaeus, at the front of the palace, and the first thing mentioned by Homer. I mean, dude, this is just genius the way Homer constructs this book. The first thing he hears is the poet Phemius singing. Now, this is the same Phemius that I mentioned at the very beginning of our lectures, book 22, line 347 and following, where Odysseus ultimately will save this poet. But the first thing he hears is singing, and he makes a comment about it. Then he will see an old dog lying on a pile of poop. We're at line 317, by the way. And tragically, the old dog is dying. And in his final moments, he raises his head, looks at Odysseus, wags his little tail. But Odysseus cannot let anyone know who he is. So Odysseus doesn't get to run up to his old dog and say hello. And Argos dies of a broken heart. We'll get to this. A powerful symbol, right? The ticks are sucking on Argos, obviously a metaphor of what these suitors are doing to the palace. And of course, this is all a setup to say, oh man, when Odysseus finally in book 22 gets his chance to jack these suitors, dude, he's going to do it, right? We know he's going to do it. Eumaeus is a smart man. He says, okay, who's going to go in first, me or you? We don't need to go in together. And Odysseus says, no, you go in, I'll go in after you. And as Odysseus steps across the threshold into his palace, Argos will expire. So much is going on in just a few lines, which is why I think this scene has often been studied so well in book 17. Odysseus in 370, line 370, now walks into his hall, for a moment leaning against the post to kind of take it all in. After 20 years gone, after sacking the city of Troy, inventing the idea of the Trojan horse and all of that, after all that he's gone through, finally he's home, and he gets to see what? A bunch of drunk guys who are eating up and taking away all of his time and trying to marry his wife to ostensibly take away his kleos as well. And he sits on the ground and he eats because Telemachus will give him a little bit of food. It's Athena who just wants to obviously goad Odysseus even more into rage, who will say, go and beg from all the suitors. All the suitors will in fact give him something to eat except for Alcinous, or Antinous. Antinous, anti meaning not, nous meaning mind. So, I mean, let's just put that in our notes right away. Antinous cannot, I mean, you can't find a worse villain than this guy, right? So he treats Odysseus really badly. Odysseus will reinvent the story he's already told to Eumaeus about being from Crete. Antinous has no interest in stories. It's a beautiful sidebar that Antinous doesn't want to hear stories. He's got no ability to respect stories at all. And he cuts Odysseus, the beggar, short, and he throws a stool at him and smashes a stool on him. Ironically, Penelope will hear about this, and it will then be Penelope's interest to find out who is this old man who has been so poorly treated. She calls in Eumaeus, and she have this conversation, and she wants to know about Odysseus, about the stranger. Who is he? Eumaeus, the swineherd, will say, he knows about Odysseus. She says, bring him to me. And Odysseus says, I will come to her, but only later, when it's darkness. Now, why this would be the case, couple of reasons, obviously. One, Odysseus has got to make sure that he is not recognized by Penelope, and so it's probably easier when it's darker. Also, of course, the poet is going to build tension, because this isn't going to happen in the next book, this meaning it's going to happen in the following book. The poet knows exactly what he's doing, in total control of narrative technique, by saying, I'll get you the story of Odysseus with his wife and the homecoming there, but it's going to have to wait. And of course, there's two actual homecomings with Penelope and Odysseus. The first one in book 19, Odysseus isn't going to let Penelope know who he is, right? Eumaeus, right before the end of the book, will come up to Telemachus and say, I got to go back and take care of your pigs. I've got to leave. And Telemachus says, make sure you come back and bring some really good pigs with you tomorrow, because we're going to have a slaughter. It's going to be quite a time. Right? Of course, no question, Homer's setting us up for all the stuff that's about to happen. Well, as I've said to you before, this is the moment where you really do want to kind of pick up and start reading, and I hope I can help you capture some of the genius of, Fagel's translation is brilliant, but the genius of the way the poet is able to bring the emotions here, and the tension. Telemachus at the beginning of the book, book 17, now let's look at a few lines. Telemachus says it's time to go. He orders Eumaeus, he says, hey, let him go beg for himself. He says at line 13, how can I put up with every passerby? My mind's weighted down with troubles. If the stranger resents it, all the worse for him. I like to tell the truth and tell it plainly. This is, of course, wonderful, because Telemachus, like his father, is wily. He gets it. Right? Every once in a while we have to tell a lie to get what we want, Telemachus is going to say here, right? Notice he's pretending as if he will not provide Xenia to the old beggar, who of course is Odysseus. Odysseus, however, says, no, I want to go to the palace and I want to beg. Finally, we have Telemachus at line 30 at the palace. Very quickly, Eurycla, the old nurse, she's going to play an important role in our story, in our poem later. She will be happy. Tears will spring to her eyes. She'll kiss and hug on Telemachus, just like Eumaeus did. In other words, this is a subtle way for the poet to let us know